Welcome to episode 7 of Radio Omnicor. I'm your host, Colleen McClintock, and today I'm joined by my guest host, Dr. Hilton Rudnick. So great to have you back in the studio. Hilton is the MD of Omnicor, and he's come to interview our guest today, and that guest is Colin Browne. Welcome, Hilton.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation with Colin and with you.
Great. As always, you can find our podcast on iTunes and our website, www.omnicor.co.za/podcast. Colin describes himself as the chief happy sandpit builder. He's a writer, a researcher, speaker, and a thought leader. And we're thrilled to talk to him about organisational engagement and how to have a happy sandpit. So this is a very exciting LinkedIn opportunity podcast here where I receive Colin's email shots, and I really enjoyed an article I read of his, and I think it's fair to say I stalked you on LinkedIn. And you very generously came to meet us, and we're thrilled to have you in the studio. And maybe you can just give yourself a bit of an introduction to our listeners and what makes your heart sing.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. And it's super to be here. My name's Colin Browne. I'm the author of a book called How to Build a Happy Sandpit, which has led to a think tank called Happy Sandpit, where we do most of our work. And really my major area of focus, the big itch I can't stop scratching, is organizational culture, employee engagement, leadership, how those three things mix together to just create great work experiences for people and leaders alike.
Well, that fits in a lot to Omnicor's tools and our focus, the leadership. As you know, we do coaching and we also do various surveys on engagement. And this is why I've invited Hilton Rudnick into the studio to throw around some ideas around what is engagement and the organizational interview that you speak about. So perhaps let's start with that, Colin.
The organizational interview?
Yeah. Why is that so important now in interview processes? I know that perhaps your thinking around psychometric assessments is a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a specific view about psychometric assessments, other than that I'm not, I don't come from that area of sort of industrial psychology or anything like that. I'm just a business guy. And to me, a lot of the decisions that I've made in my life are based on experience, gut feel, those sorts of very illogical things. I did hear a very interesting assessment about psychological tests when I spent time in Investec during the process of the interview for How to Build a Happy Sandpit, where they specifically ban those sorts of scientific tools altogether on the basis that they specifically believe the human intuitiveness is the most logical way of assessing a candidate. So it's quite a different thing, and so my thinking is somewhat echoes that, but I don't necessarily have a particular view that says don't use them. I do think from the point of view of hiring for culture, this is increasingly something that is interesting to organizations. It really means finding people who are a little bit more like us in the way they think, regardless of what they specifically think, the way in which they go about thinking it. And certainly there's evidence that that's becoming more and more popular, and perhaps a little bit of an extra fail-safe in terms of hiring to try and find people who not only can do the work but who actually will.
So maybe just kind of in defense of psychometric instruments, I mean, of course, we would never, ever want to have the impression that you should only rely on anything psychometric. I mean, we believe strongly in interviewing, and we believe strongly in fit for culture as well. In fact, often when we're selling psychometric assessments, we're the most skeptical people in the room if we're selling it as something that companies should use, because we know that they can be very one-dimensional, that they can give a lot of misinformation, and they really have to be used very carefully. So it's a little bit like, I guess, international weapons trading, that you want to be careful who you sell it to and careful the way they're going to use the weapons at the end of the day.
That's a good one.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the whole concept and the metaphor of the happy sandpit, and how you as an organization go around to how do you create a good working environment. I think many companies struggle with keeping certainly the millennials engaged. So what are your views on that, Colin?
So there's a degree of common sense which I think has got lost, and this goes back to the sort of the application of science as opposed to gut feel. And I'm not necessarily an advocate exclusively of gut feel, but I certainly think that it may have a bigger part to play. The happy sandpit methodology perhaps describes some of this, or the metaphor at least. When I was initially researching the book, the name wasn't yet decided. But I knew that in order to get senior executives, CEOs, company founders to commit to spend an hour and a half being quizzed by a relative unknown at the time, that there'd have to be some sort of a hook that would be easy for them to grasp and so on. And that's where the happy sandpit metaphor came along. And it simply goes like this, that employees in a company are a little bit like children in a sandpit. That when you have the right children in a sandpit, they'll play nicely together and build sandcastles, and maybe very elaborate ones with turrets and moats and all sorts of stuff. And they'll have such a good time doing it that they'll want to do it again tomorrow, which means that you are free to sit on the adults' table, that being the metaphor for strategy and vision, the kinds of things that leaders think they should be doing. You supervise a sandpit because you're not crazy enough to leave it completely unsupervised, but you don't have to be in the middle of it, constantly separating the kids. But you put one little bugger into that sandpit who won't share the bucket and spade, or who thinks it's okay to kick sand in somebody else's face, and someone's going to start crying. And unfortunately, it's rarely the sand kicker. It's often one of the people who pre-existed and was doing a perfectly good job of building sandcastles. So within that, what we kind of need to understand is that sandpits exist. They do have certain characteristics. Those characteristics lend themselves to certain types of people. And when we understand those things, we're better able to perhaps prevent ourselves from hiring a sand kicker and messing up a perfectly good working environment.
Which I believe you did once, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite funny. I had a sand kicker. Again, I didn't call her that prior to this little journey of mine. I thought I had other names for her, which perhaps aren't necessarily right for this. I had an organization prior to this. It's still an existing one, but it's no longer mine, where we had a really good functioning small team, but I mean punching way above our weight, doing really good work, I thought. And clients thought so too. And that made me think that I was relatively clever about hiring people and putting people in place and building teams and so on. I hired this one person around about 2009, I suppose, there it was, who even at the hiring time I kind of thought this could be an error because, again, skills and experience were evident. We even did the phone call to previous employers and got the reference. You know what happens when somebody wants to get rid of a lousy employee, right? They give you a great reference. So we got that. We took them on, and I'd kind of talked myself into this idea that although from a personality point of view there were red flags all over the place, we would integrate her, she'd become like us. In fact, what happened was we became more like her, bit by bit. Suddenly there's politics and there's division, there's cliquiness, there's all sorts of things that hadn't been us starting to happen. And so anyway, we went through Club CCMA together, and paid a little bit of visit and lost. That's the way it happens. But anyway, I was glad to see her go. I do think most people fit somewhere. I think from a cultural point of view, people have a place, and they don't just fit like square pegs in square holes. Not all holes are square. But the one observation was that perhaps I wasn't quite as good as hiring, and that I needed to understand more about how other companies did that. And that was really the journey that I went on.
I mean, it's fascinating to talk about engagement because we're believers in it too, obviously. And I mean, I think we understand, and no one could argue with the idea of having a very harmonious sandpit, that there's obviously a logical arc between that and having a very productive workforce. But you always hear about the exceptions. I mean, you hear about the kind of maverick leaders, the kind of curmudgeonly people who are militaristic, abrasive, but still build amazing companies. I mean, do they build those amazing companies despite those attributes that they have? Or is there place maybe for more than one model? Maybe there's some places or some businesses or maybe some phases of a business where full engagement is not the only attribute.
Sure. I mean, I think my personal view is that there is no room whatsoever for that kind of a leader. And I think we just have to draw a line in the sand and say it doesn't exist. It can't be a good thing. Now, immediately, I'm sure you'll throw back at me people like Steve Jobs, Sol Kerzner, Gordon Ramsay, people who've been really challenging leaders, and sort of they're quite aggressive and all of those sorts of things. And I would argue that partly the reason they're successful is because they couple that abrasiveness with wild amounts of charisma. I mean, nobody could argue that Steve Jobs was wildly charismatic, that Gordon Ramsay, that Sol Kerzner. But if they didn't have that, then I wonder whether they'd necessarily have the same sorts of results. I do know some quite abrasive leaders who run companies that are fundamentally financially successful. I don't know whether they could be a lot better, they could do a lot better work, whether they would be able to hold on to people who might be able to give them better ideas. I mean, you often see, and I can think of one particular guy that I deal with quite regularly, who's been at this company that I work with one of my suppliers. He's been there 15 years or so, and I'm pretty sure he looks more and more downbeaten every time I see him. I don't think he's going to leave. I think he's maybe had the spirit knocked out of him, and maybe he's paid enough, maybe it's fine. I think that if you were to light a spark of creativity under that guy, you might get more out of him, and that's just my view.
So I mean, the risk is that while you could have those people who have the more negative attributes, the risk is about retention, that those people are less likely to stay, that your investment in them is less likely to be sustainable because they're going to just leave and go somewhere else as soon as they get an opportunity. I mean, is that it, or are the other risks?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I think Stockholm syndrome exists. You know, I think people get to a point where they just don't really see the wood for the trees anymore. They don't really see a back door, and so they stay and stay and stay. And I think, I think you have to go a long way to find people who are really, really uninterested, who don't care about disappointing. I think most people want to try and do a decent job. And I think those, people tend to lean towards that. I just think you might get a hell of a lot more out of them if you had an environment that actually invited them to be bigger contributors. I suppose not all business leaders want that, and I mean, some of them but I'm not sure they necessarily know what they could have, which is why they don't choose it. Specifically when it comes to retention, I mean, there's an argument that we retain bad people because they just don't really leave. We retain average people because they don't realize there's a better opportunity, and we retain great people because we grow them. If we don't grow them, I'm not sure even the best culture in the entire world would be of any use. Arguably, perhaps growth is a part of culture. But, a great working environment, a great place to be is brilliant in the short term. Right. But if I don't feel that I'm better off this year than I was last year, I don't think I'll be here.
Right.
So, Colin, I'm interested to put you on the spot a bit and say, of all the research that you've done, which is the leader that stands out for you as someone who you would want to work with?
There's actually a very large number of them, and that was the beauty of the research, was the fact that I went into it not really knowing what I would find. I mean, my accent may not reflect this, but I am South African, and I'm very pro-South African, and I don't think we do a good enough job of sort of building up the things that we do well. I think we're pretty bad at talking about those. So in a way, this journey of mine was brand new exploration, finding people that surprised me. Guys that stand out, I guess, are the leadership team at a company called Ovations Group, which is a little-known IT firm on Witkoppen Road. I mean, Reiniger and Francois Duploy are the two particular culture-focused people there. I think what they're doing is maverick beyond belief. I think it's really good. Clearly, the leaders at Investec, and at the time I spent a bit of time with Mark Kahn, who was in charge of HR. He's now been promoted to global head of HR, based in London. That man might know more about this stuff than anybody on earth. Honestly, he's so well versed in it. Gideon Galloway at King Price is absolutely the kind of guy who tells you, he kind of reflects the idea that maybe sometimes you should just do it and see how it works out. So there were so many really, really delightfully brilliant guys out there and ladies out there doing really interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you'll be happy to know we've already interviewed Mark Kahn, so we agree with you in terms of his expertise. So what were these guys doing that was so maverick? What are some of the actual deliverables in the organization?
So, it's often not the really sexy stuff. Now, we've just come back from King Price last week. I took a group of executives out there to go and have a look. And King Price is overt. It's got color, and it's got craziness, and it's got all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, it's really, you can't help but feel the energy when you walk in. Everything's fizzing and popping. When you go into a place like Ovations Group, it's a much more conservative, corporate-looking office. So it's not always about those sorts of things, and we can get distracted. We can often look at these things and think those are what makes culture great, and actually it isn't. The research showed us that it comes down to 5 fundamental things. And if I think about one of those, which is open communication, for example, that's something that Ovations Group does incredibly well. A lot of organizations are quite good at training. They're not good at learning. They're not good at learning from themselves. And if you were to regard an organization of, say, I can't remember how many people are at Ovations, but I'd be lying if I said, but a couple of hundred anyway. If you regard that as a single brain, of a single organism with 200 brains in it, there's a lot of experience, a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge, a lot of stuff existing in there. All you have to do is have a mechanism to try and tap into it, and that's where a lot of companies fall down. And then with the mechanism in place, you just have to have the willingness to actually listen and maybe hear the good ideas. It's something that Ovations does incredibly well. So a simple thing, they do what they call these espresso sessions every second Friday. They randomly invite employees. Everybody, over the course of a year, everybody gets a shot. The CEO, so Rainer and Francois, the CFO, sit down with them, and they have a couple of hours of just, as they put it, just conversation. There's no topic. You're not allowed to speak about work. There's no specific preparation you can do. But when you get a group of people sitting around a table chatting, conversations tend to have their peaks, and those peaks are often ideas that are just, they could be really influential inside the company.
That's a brilliant idea.
So. It sounds fascinating. I mean, I think, if I had a buck for every time I'd heard that communication needs to be improved in organizations, I'd be a rich man, because you hear it all the time, and it's so fundamental. And I'm glad that you put some real concrete thinking onto it, because it's so hard to know, like, what do you do if you want to improve company communication? You called it open communication, which is, I think, more pointed than just communication in general. But you mentioned 5 aspects of culture. I mean, what were the other ones that came up for you?
So the five that we developed came out from, you can imagine with that much research, you have a hell of a lot of information. You've got to try and distill it. So these aren't the only 5. They're the 5 that we observed came up again and again. The first one is a willingness to extend trust. Right, so that's a big thing, and I mean, these aren't necessarily groundbreaking things, but the application of them can be really quite interesting. The second one was a taste for adult conversations, and that comes down to communication. The third one was the de-emphasis of hierarchy. So we're not talking about changing anything operationally, we're just talking about the way it feels. The fourth one was respect for the two-way street, and that's largely about growth, but also about reputation and things like that. And the fifth one was an obsession with values.
Wow. I mean, would it be okay to go into them in a little bit more detail? Because I think we would be very interested to hear for our listeners about, so if they wanted to change their culture, I mean, first of all, how malleable is it, and what would be where they would start?
Yeah. Any one of those things, I think, they all interlock. And one thing we've discovered is that if you focus exclusively on building trust, inevitably it's going to spill over into communication. If you focus on communication, it's going to spill over into trust. If you focus on growth, that's going to inevitably have a communication aspect, which also promotes trust. And so there's those sorts of things. I would say start anywhere. It's rare that any company is going to have all 5 of those things down pat. But even if you've only got 2 or 3, even if you're only working on them, you can start to see all sorts of changes. So, do you want specific examples of each of those?
Well, of those, I mean, trust seems like the one that's most difficult to kind of, change an organization from the inside. I mean, how would you characterize the baby steps in improving trust in an organization? So
I think the one thing that we have to understand is that the way in which we structure. Look at the standard org chart. The standard org chart has the CEO at the top, the ex-code just below them, and then you have this middle management area in the middle, quite broad sometimes. You have these people down the bottom who are the bottom note, who are the ones doing all the work, who are customer-facing, who are the ones that actually, never mind about empowering them and sort of rah-rah. Very simply, they have the best feedback. They just have the best experience. I mean, every single day they hear stuff. And one of the things that's observable, and if you look at it the way, for example, the governments of Iran and Turkey have tried to shut down Twitter, right? Networks defeat hierarchies every single day. We live in a world where networks defeat hierarchies, and hierarchies by definition are designed to protect. The people at the top are shielded. That's what the food system is about, right? What's it called anyway? The
food chain.
The food chain. That's what the food chain is about. We sit at the top of it so we don't get eaten by stuff, whereas little animals down the bottom have to worry about this all the time. And so there's these sorts of things are reflected in life. But what happens is, because there's often no ability for information to pass up a hierarchy, what happens is it all floats around down below. People develop ideas about things that may not be real. And so what you're doing by existing within that sort of an organizational structure, the typical organizational structure, is you are preventing the flow of information upwards. You are really being very misguided in the flow of information downwards, and the people down the bottom simply feel nobody's listening and nobody really cares. I think if we focus on specifically enhancing trust, the work we need to do is this. We need to interrogate every single policy and every single process that exists in the company and ask whether it's absolutely necessary. Because the reality is we write policies to protect ourselves against the 3% of people who might mess us around, and we handcuff the 97% who would never have done it even without the policy. And you can see that when you try to return a pair of pants, right? I mean, have the right slip, make sure you haven't worn them, do it within 7 days, have the original Why? Do you think I'm a crook? I don't think you do. I just think you think I could be. And it's an absurd thing that we do to each other. We do this internally all the time. So one person misbehaves, HR writes a policy. I don't think these things are necessary. I think what we do is we take away the natural human intuitiveness. We've hired smart people and we're telling them not to be so smart. And that's part of the reason that we lack trust in organizations.
I think that's the whole Netflix policy around, you don't need leave policy, and it's speaking a lot more to virtual teams. You manage your own time. And I think that the organizations are shifting in terms of trust and ownership, and especially with talented people. They don't want to be micromanaged, and they want to have more of an entrepreneurial relationship, I think, with the organization.
So, Colin, it's fascinating. I'm sitting here thinking and translating your thoughts into, so what do I do in my own business? And, I think we're well-intentioned about all the things that you've mentioned, or those that I've understood. But, so like in terms of open communication, we get together as a company meeting and we throw issues out there, and we're really looking for a robust engagement. But, just the usual suspects will have something to say, and 80% of the business will be quiet. How do you get past those barriers?
So I think the one thing that we sometimes misunderstand is that this stuff takes time, it takes consistency. It's a bit like, when do you stop telling your children to say please and thank you? You never do, right? It just goes on and on. And there's often this perception that we can change culture and we can just kind of flip a switch and off it'll go by making wholesale changes. And often that's why, that's why a lot of things, culture change efforts fail. I think when it comes down to it, if you take an example, so here's an example of how this worked. When Marco Fennikerk took over an Incredible Connection about 5 years ago, he's no longer there, but he was a CEO for Incredible Connection for a while, and he walked into what he describes as a relatively dysfunctional company. There wasn't really a lot of accountability, so a lot of decisions got delayed. Marco's not that kind of guy. Marco's impatient, and Marco's aggressive is the wrong word to use, but he's determined. He just wants stuff done, and he takes no prisoners. And he decided that the company had long lost its ability to listen to itself. It had long lost the ability to share information, and so he took the EXCO members around the country, and he had these open sessions with all members of staff. And of course he said, you can ask anything you want, who wants to ask something, and nobody did. Of course nobody did. So his way of dealing with it was simply to say, well, look, can I just put something on the table? The chief operating officer was here we hired one 2 months ago, he's now gone. Isn't anybody curious about why? When they're like, all the hands go up, he says, well, somebody needs to ask me then. And it's that sort of thing. So you're actually saying it's okay to ask this, but you probably don't believe me when I tell you I really want to hear it. Over time, however, proof is in the pudding. It's I hate that expression, but there you go. I've said it now, and it's on the record. But over time, that's what happens. People need proof. They need a little bit of consistency. It's just the reality. But I think you probably sound like you're on the right track with that, Hilton.
Well, yeah, I think that we certainly want to, I think that the pointers that you've given me is that you maybe got to, it's more than giving people permission, you've actually got to lead them a little bit further until they find their courage in kind of doing it. And maybe you've got to show the courage by putting some of the difficult issues that you've grappled with as a business on the table and put them forward to things to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to, so the question might become how much transparency is necessary, how much transparency is even appropriate. I'm a big believer in transparency, but clearly there are boundaries. One doesn't disclose all of the sensitive financial information just because somebody asked. But I do think you need to be able to explain why you can't share that information, as opposed to just saying, sorry, that's confidential. And I think a lot of it is a matter of just being much more open about what we can share, why we can't share it, what we can, what we can't, why we will, why we won't, all of that. So no matter what, there is a conversation being had.
Right. Right.
So in light of the economy, Colin, many of our clients are restructuring, they're retrenching. Some teams are worse affected. How do you keep an organisation popping and fizzing, as you might say, when all of this real stuff is going on? People aren't interested in being happy. Their colleagues are being, retrenched, and it's a reality now.
Yeah, so there's always the fear, when people are left behind. I mean, the ones who have gone, and that's kind of sad. But the ones who are there are the ones that you're obviously got to continue working with. And I always think, and funnily enough, we're still on the subject of communication, because it's the biggest thing around that particular time. You need to just double down, triple down. I mean, be really, really available, really open, have a lot of conversations. There's going to be a lot of questions. You've also got to be very clear about what it is you've done and why you've done it. And not glib about it, not give them the corporate spiel. It's at this point where I think the sort of the humanness of conversations needs to become much more real, because actually, no matter what, they've lost a little bit of faith in you, they've lost a little bit of belief in you, and so we really need to be clear that we're getting the reasons out that we've done this. Bottom line is they're the ones who've stayed, and although one doesn't necessarily want to say this, you can, the implication is clear. You're the ones that we still want.
Right.
You're the ones that are needed around here.
I mean, in if I distill your kind of 5 attributes, and I don't know if I've got them fully, but I mean, it sounds like there's a subtext around that of human connection, relationships. Be human, forget about the kind of trappings and the hierarchy. Have honest conversations with each other, that those things are important. I mean, is that an underlying foundation to some of your thinking?
So let me tell you another little story, Hilton, which might explain this. You hear a lot this term work-life balance, right? And how we all have to try and find work-life balance. And the idea seems to be that we work so hard that if we offset that by taking up a hobby, mountain biking or something, then we'll be happier. And the reality is, though, I think we all know that's simply not the case. The reason I think we speak about work-life balance is simply because work doesn't feel enough like life. And so this all comes down to just a normal adult experience. If I observe my life, I am an adult. I'm the, dare I say, head of a household. I'm the co-head of a household, just in case she hears this. And that means that I have status. I have a piece of property of my own. There are little people in there. There are animals. There are adults. An adult. If I want to make changes to it, there's very little that I have to do in order. There's very few people I have to consult. I'm kind of able to do that. So I have status. Second thing, there's trust in my relationship. And I don't just mean in terms of fidelity, although I hope that's true for everybody, but in terms of, Linda takes care of some things, I take care of other things. We don't have a lot of status update meetings to make sure that things have been done. We don't fill in too many Excel spreadsheets. I know she's got my back, I know I've got hers, and it kind of just functions. And occasionally, there's a letdown, there's a setback, but I mean, for the most part, that's just how things are. My opinion is valued. That doesn't mean that I always have the dominant voice. In fact, I don't often have the dominant voice, but my opinion is valued. It's rare that anything happens at home that I know absolutely nothing about. And then, the best part about being an adult is that I get to pick who I spend time with. I'm no longer dictated to by anybody else in my own life. If I like you, Hilton, let's hang out. If I don't, then let's not. It's as simple as that. I don't have to call you. So that's my life, and I'm really engaged in my life because it's tailor-made for me, by me, it fits me, it answers all of my questions, ticks all of my boxes. But when I come to work, something quite different happens. Far from having the status of a homeowner and all of that kind of stuff, my status is dictated by somebody else. And it may have absolutely nothing to do with the way in which I perceive it. And the manifestation is the desk and the chair in the corner of the room I'm told to sit in. I'm not trusted. And we go back to that 97%, 3% thing. It's not that you don't trust me. It's just that in the effort to get rid of errors and to try and make things as perfect as you can, everything's just been pushed down to a process. I'm asked to follow stuff instead of using my common sense, instead of using my intelligence. My opinion, I don't think anybody's listening, and that's what we've been talking about now. There isn't a mechanism, and even if there was one, I doubt you're listening. But if I don't feel trusted and I don't feel that you're really listening, then you can't ask me to take ownership of anything. You just can't, because I'm not actually responsible for the outcome at the end of the day. You are. There's not much I can do to influence it. And then the worst part about being, an employee is that I can't pick who I spend time with. In fact, what happens is Hilton turns up on Monday morning and says, "Here's Colin, make him feel at home." I didn't pick Colin. Maybe Colin's okay. I certainly hope he is. But if he isn't, I have to find a way to work around this guy for the period that we're together. I mean, it's enough to push people out of organizations sometimes, the people they have to work with. And so what happens is I put on a work hat. And my work hat is very different to my life hat. It's less engaged. It's less interested. I take less ownership. If things go wrong, I don't really make changes. I just shut up about them. This is the problem. So it's not so much about being much more human. It's just about observing that adults have certain attributes which are often completely denied in the workplace.
Okay.
I think that's a great segue into the whole idea of onboarding, because you mentioned that we just had to live with it. You've arrived. How do you onboard someone with the culture that you really want to develop and maintain?
So this is a topic that I'm very big on, I have to say. I mean, onboarding. Then we might have an issue with specific nomenclature there. So let's just be clear. Induction is, to me, the process by which we market the organization to other people who will be responsible for further marketing the organization. Onboarding might be the bit where we actually give them a desk and a laptop. And so specifically to the onboarding process, it depends on how you want to be perceived as an organization. I think most corporate employees turn up at work and spend the first week sitting around twiddling their thumbs while somebody finds them a laptop, even though they knew they were coming a month ago. There are some companies that do this really well. They get that part of it down pat. And one that comes to mind is a company called Digital Solutions Group in Rosebank, where if you join them, they'll have an email address set up with you during your notice period at the previous organization, and they'll be sharing information with you. I mean, you're now a part of their family. I mean, they're not asking you to do it during your working hours and steal from your current employer. Do it in the evenings. But nevertheless, they're by the time you arrive, you've already had a degree of work done. You're already slightly in the picture. The induction process, though, is one where I think most is a strong word, but a hell of a lot of organizations need a hell of a lot of help. But even great organizations that have great cultures have really shocking induction processes. It's a bit like we hire you, you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, brilliant, we really want you to join. The opportunity we've got for you is really good, but first we're going to kill you with a week of PowerPoint in a boring room where people come in and give you really lousy presentations about information you don't need and will not remember. It's a bit like being introduced to 30 people at a party. By the time you get to person 30, you can't remember person 1 through 19. You've only got the last 5. And it's a bit like that. We'll spend time on the procedural aspects, showing how to fill in a leave form and all of those sorts of things, when I'm not going to remember it. And the first time I need to do one, I'm going to ask how to do it anyway.
Right.
So these things to me should be we should be creating our environment as induction sessions that enable people to just attach their emotional hooks to the organization. You can imagine the organization like a net. Just find all these little points of emotional attachment. And there we're specifically relating to getting people to align their values with the values of the organization through narrative, explaining not what they are, but why they are the way they are and why we care about them and what they've done for us. Those sorts of things. I think there's a lot more required to make that work well than is mostly being done.
I mean, it kind of gets into the space of, forget about the kind of over-regulated induction program, but talk about a cultural induction, about what do you have to do in this business to succeed? How do you get value here? How do you deal with criticism? It's really around, how does this whole system function in a way that you can get into it and feel a part of it in a good way? I mean, is it that?
Yeah, 1,000,000%. It's exactly that. So I think that part of induction is very much a narrative. I often say that. It's one of my stipulations that if you're going to do induction properly, you probably need to hire a chief narrative officer. But somebody, I don't care if it's your outsourced PR person that works on it 2 days a week, or whether it's somebody internally who's responsible for this. But organizations are a bit like they're a bit like grandparents. When your grandparents are gone, so are all the stories inside their head. Right. You've lost them. You can try and find remnants of them, but the good stuff's gone. And organizations are full of stories that describe it in the most fundamental ways. Now, the way in which we describe our organizations typically is through this very bland set of values that somehow we've tweaked together through I don't know what, that don't really describe anything. The ones where we pick 5 words, and we pick them because when you put them on a cup, the first letter of each word makes another word downwards. You choose integrity because you needed an I, kind of thing. And I really think that's the kind of thing that happens. And that doesn't give us the ability to really sort of observe and interact and identify with the organization in a meaningful way. There are far better ways of doing that.
Right.
Well, I'd love to know, how do you create values then? What is a good way to interrogate what your organizational values are?
I think if you look at companies such as, and I'm trying to think of a few now, like a company like King Price, for example, is quite a good example of this, because the values absolutely describe the founder. They utterly describe the founder. Now, for right or wrong, that's a solid set of values. Gideon's a pretty capable guy. He's built a pretty good business. So he's doing something right. And those values are off the wall. I mean, he's got things like courageous freedom as one of the values. That's one of the things that he inspires people to do, have the guts to go out and try something. And they mean it. And so with those, you're able to kind of describe a way of thinking, a way of being. You're able to offer a filter for how to be here and what's expected and what's allowed. I don't think a lot of permission to play values like integrity and respect necessarily do that. I call them permission to play values because if you don't have integrity or respect, you shouldn't be in business anyway. Mm-hmm. If you have to specifically say, people, this is what we expect from you, you might have a bigger problem than you think. So I think that, But other than that, if you were going on a values expedition now, where you decided you were going to sort of reassess the values and decide whether they're right, I think the obvious thing to do is to look at the leaders of the organization, solicit opinion from them. We don't do this very democratically. We don't want voices from all over the company. We do want those who've made a particular commitment or a particular achievement, or who are obviously very committed, those sorts of people. People who've got a really strong view, not of what we want the company to be, but of what it is. And then once we've understood what it is in a very real sense, we can start to look at whether or not this is actually are we going to get where we need to be in the next 5 years, or do we need to adapt a little bit? I don't think we can just do this through a bland, HR survey process. I think it has to be a deep emotional journey. And I mean, think of it like this, guys. Values exist for one reason. They exist to help us pick between two lousy options. Right? If you discover that your best friend, husband and wife, one's cheating on the other, what do? You're going to lose something no matter what you do. If you tell, you lose for telling. If you don't, you lose for keeping quiet. Either way, you're going to lose something, but you haven't chosen this. Now, you have to pick a way of being, because you can't just sit on the fence on that. Either way, you've picked something. And what you pick is the thing that enables you to sleep peacefully at night. If you sleep peacefully at night, you're in accordance with your values. That's what organizations should be doing. It should be as deep as that.
I mean, it sounds like, to use your analogy where you were looking at work-life balance and you were kind of taking it onto a very personal level, on some kind of way, an organization has a personality and it has a way of being in the world and a worldview. And your values almost have to reflect, like, what is our worldview? What do we stand for? What is important over here? How do we make decisions? And that in some way formulates into a set of meaningful ideas that become values.
And they don't have to be sexy or adventurous. I mean, the conservative organizations aren't going to choose things like courageous freedom as a value, and nor should they. They've got to be authentic. If you look at an organization like Comair, for example, now that's a fairly conservative organization simply because it has to be from a financial point of view. I mean, I heard the numbers last week about how much profit they make per ticket, and it'll make you cry. But this company operates on like 3% margins. The fuel price is it's difficult. A 737 costs $50 million. That's 700 million rand. You've got 10 of those. That's 7 billion rand tied up in capital you can't use. I mean, really, being very efficient is a major thing. And so efficiency is one of its values. But efficiency spills over into all sorts of things. The origin of it was, Kalula planes don't tend to arrive a minute early. They tend to arrive on time. The reason for it, arriving early is unnecessary and it will use more fuel. That fuel costs, R1 million a month is what they spend on fuel. So there's a lot of cash going out. So conserve it, use it efficiently. But that efficiency as a value spills over into other things. These guys don't print a lot of stuff. They're efficient with paper and ink. They don't have meetings where superfluous people are not invited because that's inefficient with other people's time. It becomes that kind of thing. Now, if you are the kind of person who just likes to print out, every single color document you've got, you're going to struggle there because you're going to be picked up on it. It's a thing that keeps the organization awake at night.
Okay.
So, Colin, I'd love to pick up. I don't want to lose the idea around looking at those 5 factors or attributes that you've come across in your research. So maybe take us through the rest of them.
Yeah, I'd love to. So let's just go through them in order. So trust, I mean, I say in order, they're the order in which they appear in my presentations. It's not necessarily in order specifically of importance. But if we think about trust, so we've dealt with the whole 97-3 thing, etc., the myth of work-life balance, how those things... but if you look at a specific example, I mean, Rovos Rail is quite an interesting one. It's an organization that has... it's a hotel on wheels, essentially. So when the hotel leaves the station, it's on its own. And there's a lot of the pressure that goes with that. If you have a guest that has an appendix problem and you're based at a fixed hotel, you can phone ER24 or whoever. If you're rolling through the Karoo at the time, you've got to stop at the nearest town and go and wake up a doctor. I mean, there's a lot of responsibility required. I mean, thankfully these things don't happen, but they could. And then add to that the fact that it's typically got young people. It's a travel company, and by the time you've got your ship's photographer phase out of your system, you're probably not 30 yet. So it ends up having to put trains, really expensive trains with really expensive equipment, high-paying customers, and its customer service reputation in the hands of a 24-year-old. And I said to Ranfos, how do you do this? How do you get that? And one of the things that he was saying, it's quite interesting, was that he's looking for people, when he hires people, exclusively that have what he calls hospitality in their soul. And I said, well, that's very Rohan, right? I said, well, that's interesting, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. He says, okay, fine, this isn't pretty. He wants people who want to clean up vomit. And I said, well, nobody wants to do that, right? And he says, no, but there are people in this world who, if it needs to be done, they will do it instantly rather than inconvenience a customer. Right. Those sorts of people, because they are naturally customer service oriented, naturally just bent towards service, if you're enabling them with an opportunity to extend what they would naturally do, his observation is that they'll do it even better. And so he doesn't have a lot of option but to sort of extend high levels of trust to people. He's careful about who he hires, but also, therefore, he also creates this very sort of voluntary environment inside the company where they don't have a promotional structure. If an opportunity comes up, they'll kind of point the finger and say, "Who's interested? You go ahead and do it. Let's see you step up." So that's quite an interesting thing. I mean, I don't think there's a million ways to skin that cat. But the one thing I will tell you about trust is it has to start with the extension rather than the reception of it, or you never get anywhere. Right. There is definitely a cart before the horse, or a horse before the cart on that one. Okay. Communication, I mean, we spoke about the espresso session. I think you get the idea there. The de-emphasis of hierarchy is a fascinating one to me, because I think there is a cookie-cutter mold. We talked about that organization chart earlier, and there's kind of a cookie-cutter mold. We build businesses to be much the same, and I think what happens often is that companies are started by entrepreneurs who hate where they are. They hate the rules, hate the regulations, hate the policies and the procedure, hate their boss, right? They think they can go and do something better on their own. And so they go out into the world and they start a company exactly like the one they hated. And part of the reason for that is because there is this perception that there is a way of building a business, and you won't be taken seriously if you don't build it according to those constraints. But then you look at a company like Sage, Softline. Softline is now called Sage, but take the Pastel division of that. Pastel's run by a guy called Steve Cohen, and Steve's about as maverick a leader as you get in South Africa. He's I'm sure it costs a lot of money to dress as scruffily as he does, but he's very, very casual. He doesn't have a single ounce of ceremony about him. He doesn't even have a desk, much less an office. He sits wherever there's an available desk.
I believe he once did a company meeting in his underpants. So.
That wouldn't surprise me. I mean, it really, I haven't heard that one, but it wouldn't surprise me. He arrives at work on his motorcycle, and if he's got an early meeting, he'll get one of his guys to put his backpack and his helmet on a table upstairs so people know he's not late just because he's the boss. He's actually at work. He's very conscious of these sorts of things. I said to him, Steve, how do you preserve a chain of command if you're so obviously down and dirty with the people? And he says it's actually not an issue. His thing very, very largely is that by de-emphasizing the hierarchy, by getting himself closer to the people, he's actually able to observe more of what goes on, participate more in what goes on, and actually access that large, still pulsating pastel brain, if you like, of multiple brains. He'll say that occasionally he has to put his foot down and stand up and shout and say, "Guys, you're driving me mad, will you just stop?" But for the most part, he gets on with it. The two-way street was one you weren't entirely certain about, Hilton, yes. And let me explain that. So I know when I join an organization as an employee what you expect from me. It's in my contract, it's in my letter of appointment. I know how I'll be measured, I know what I'll be paid, I know what my responsibilities are, all of that. What I don't know is what I'm getting in return. And please don't tell me it's a paycheck, because whilst I'll accept there is a degree of unemployment in this country, rather, and there's some maybe holding on to a job is a good idea. I don't think you hold on to good people with that kind of an attitude. I think people do have options, and so one of the things that's observable is if there is a feeling of growth, like I'm better off this year than I was last year because I work here, then people tend to stay. Investec's a classic example of this. They've got people who have been there for a decade, who started in the contact center and today are doing really complex multi-billion-dollar financing deals between Boeing and Delta Airlines or something. And it's not the culture that keeps them there. I'm convinced of it. The culture is what keeps them happy for a short period of time. It's the growth that enables them to kind of stay there for the long term. So I think growth is a big thing. And an interesting aside, I was told, I don't know this for a fact, it's anecdotal, but I was told that when the unions in Germany negotiate on an annual basis, as unions do, they negotiate about growth, not cash. Now, they're not interested in increases in salary for our members, they're interested in increases in skills, which are by default more marketable. So the one thing follows the other. I do think in order for that one to be true, however, we have to get some of the other stuff off the table. And we go back to Hertzberg's hygiene versus motivator factors. Happiness and unhappiness. One solves happiness but with growth and all of those sorts of things. But one only observes that when people are not unhappy. Unhappiness is about, I'm paid enough. And I, those sort of hygiene factors. I have enough leave. Right. If we don't have those, that's the focus of the conversation, and nobody's ever going to be happy, and they're never going to focus on growth. So it does require you to get certain things off the table first. But if you do that, growth's a big thing. And with that, there's also the association of being with a company that is well perceived externally. So if you think about the IBM experience of the 60s, 70s, 80s, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Working for IBM was great because doors opened for you. Thank you, company that I work for, right? So that's a thing. And then the last one of the five is this obsession with values. And we've spoken a bit about that. There's no doubt that companies that have a deep set of values that are able to speak about those and live those in an observable way are better at driving engagement.
So, I mean, I wanted to pick up on the hierarchy one. Exactly how far you would take that. I mean, are you an advocate of no hierarchy or limited hierarchy or some hierarchy, or just like a nominal hierarchy where people know where they fit, maybe for the purpose of salary banding or something, but no power? I mean, help me understand your thinking around it a bit better.
So let me be clear. I'm not talking about changing operational structures one little bit. I think companies that talk about having a flat structure either are small or inefficient, because there's no doubt that the more you have, that pyramid structure really is quite necessary. I'm not concerned with that. I'm just concerned with the way it feels. So if you take the old, Lou Platt was the CEO of HP in the 90s, and he's the one who coined the term management by walking around. And that was very much a way of diminishing hierarchy. A lot of executives are prone to sit on the executive floor and sit there, and we all know the executive floor is the one that gets the overhaul whenever an overhaul happens, and it's plush and delicious and well carpeted and all that kind of stuff. Whereas down below, nothing ever happens. It's that. So where the executive experience during working hours is similar to that of the employees, I think you diminish hierarchy. It's not about different pay bands. It's not about trying to change that.
Okay.
I think, sorry, Hilton, I think that if we look at these factors, I think if we look at Omnicor anyway, I think that as leaders you're doing well in that space. I think there's lots that we can learn. And Colin, it was a real pleasure to just chat to you with all your experience, and I just love hearing the real business stories that you bring, because it doesn't feel like you've just read it in some American book. So that for me has been one of the highlights of interviewing you. And
No, I appreciate it, Colin. I feel like we could carry on talking for another hour and still have, a lot to learn from you. It's been fascinating. I never got to some of my best questions, I think. So maybe we could set up another time, but thanks very much for sharing with us. It was really informative.
Guys, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, after that discussion, the question begs to be answered: how happy is your sandpit? And can you change your mindset as a leader or an employee to improve organisational engagement? Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We would really value it if you could subscribe and tell your friends about our podcast. You can find us on iTunes. Check out our website, www.omnicor.co.za/podcast, and give us a comment, send us a question, engage with us on Facebook. We'd love to connect. Thank you so much.